Black people don't get weary. Them take off the shackles and chains and say them free with. But we still on a mental slavery. Wanna sing with the Star Trail posse, my lord. Fire pan rum, people ball and them scissors and comb. Black people want go home. On Mount Zion and the righteous.
Hey guys, what's good? Alright, so we're back again. Boom. Cup for today right there. Turn it around on the other side. Boom, right there. Alright. Probably should have done this like for last week's lectures, but it is what it is. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about globalization. And, so this lecture fits in pretty nicely, I think, to the ones earlier.
Shut it! Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. All right. So globalization. So we're going to do, as usual, 3 things we want to get done. So one, we're going to talk about a little bit what globalization is and see that it is a multidimensional concept. So there are various elements to globalization, including economic and military. 2, we're going to look at some of the economic structuralist approaches to globalization and see how they lead us to ask different questions about what it is, who set up the process of globalization, and who it benefits. And 3, we're going to talk, which is related to that, about what globalization means for ideas about security and freedom and liberty and all things that make human society, in theory, great, right? This is great. It's fantastic. Yeah, you know what? It's just gonna have to be like that. Just be like, look, this is what it's like, alright? So if you remember when we were talking about Rodney and Galliano and the structuralists in the previous video, one of the things that you probably picked up on was that they were very skeptical about the possibility of countries, or I shouldn't say countries, I should say people in the global south to develop. And their general argument is that the economic structure of capitalism serves certain interests to the detriment of others. And they link the current condition of the third world or the post-colonial world to as something that was shaped by the structure of colonialism. And the conclusion they come to, and Galliano in particular, although Rodney as well, is that the prospect for development in the global south is very dim at best, right? Which, if you look at the evidence, does seem to be a little bit problematic. And so I hinted at this earlier when I mentioned that Galliano and Rodney and Gunderfrank and others do make some space for the possibility of pockets of wealth and development, so to speak, in the global south, what we would call north and the south. But overall, there is some evidence to suggest that things in the formerly colonized world or the developing world might not be as dire. Oh God. Might not be as dire as they indicated, right? So, for example, if you look at some of the following data, what you see are some signs that some of the poorest people in the developing world are actually getting better, that their lives are getting better, and in fact that there's less incidence of poverty in developing countries. So this, for instance, shows the share of urban households as a percentage of the population in China, and this is taken between 2012 and the projected growth in 2022. And what you see is that in China, the upper and mass middle class, you're having more people move from the mass middle class and the poor class into the upper middle class, and a very small percentage into the affluent class in the graph on the left. Further, in this picture right here, this graph right here, so this is a figures taken from the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers automobile production trends in 2018. And what it shows is that in India, you have a steadily increasing, not a dramatically increasing, but a steadily increasing size of production of industrial vehicles, right? Passenger vehicles, commercial vehicles, and so on, okay? And the grand total overall has increased noticeably, right? Again, not dramatically, but noticeably between 2011 to 2017. So what this suggests is that two things. So one, what we see taking place in developing countries is in fact over time been modernization, been growth, been industrialization. India's producing vehicles. Mexico is one of the exporters of goods that have GMOs. So is Argentina. You have, manufacturing. Of course, in China is one of the major hubs of manufacturing. South Africa at one point in time had a nuclear weapons program. And there are a variety of countries all throughout the developing world or underdeveloped world, or however you want to term it, the global south, that have actually shown significant progress in ways that seem to undercut a lot of what Galliano and Rodney were saying. Similarly, you could take a country like South Korea, right? Like most people think of South Korea as a modern nation state, and it is. But South Korea was also a very heavily underdeveloped country in the 1950s and 1960s, right? Like coming out of the Korean War. In fact, in the 1950s, it was about on par with Ghana in terms of its development level of development and industrialization. So the fact that it has in fact achieved its current status does suggest that the deterministic view that Galliano and Rodney and Gunderfrank presented about development in the global south might have been a little bit overstated. The other thing to keep in mind when looking at Galliano and Rodney and Gunderfrank is that they were very uncritical, let's say, of the Soviets. So a lot of the, writing again in the context of the Cold War, a lot of their language suggests that they held up the Soviet Union as a paragon of development and modernity and progress, when in reality it was a backwards, sclerotic regime that was brutally repressive and tremendously inefficient in the production of goods. And that was part of the reason, of course, why the Soviet Union ended up collapsing late 1980s, early 1990s. That said, there are still some insights from Galliano and Gunderfrank and others that does seem relevant to explaining what is taking place in the world right now, and again, how we think about things like security and human welfare and so on, right? So, just to recap, when we read about Rodney and Galliano, again, I mentioned this idea that what they are economic structuralists. They fall under the theory of economic structuralism. And so that again argues that, so one, the organizing principle is anarchy, which, again, we're very familiar with at this point in time. Second, as a structure, we look at the differentiation of units. And so you have some elements in the international system, again, looking at classes that serve different purposes. And then you have distribution of capabilities, which is rooted around the ability to set the terms of the economic agenda, guide monetary flows, and so on. Now, when we think of globalization, the reason why I say that their tools can be used to explain what's taking place in globalization is because it gives us different ways of evaluating how globalization is progressing and how that's affecting the welfare of people around the world, United States as well as Zimbabwe or any other country. When we think about globalization, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For many people, globalization is an economic process. So we talk about globalization, you should think about the movement of firms, things like McDonald's showing up in other countries, transnational banking and so on, right? The global movement of finance. And that is a part of globalization, but globalization is a lot bigger than that, okay? And so the overall way that people use to describe globalization, or if people were going to define globalization as a term, a definition that I've heard, and I'm paraphrasing, is that globalization is the integration of processes around the world such that activity in one region becomes important and interconnected to activity in another region. And what's important about using this kind of broad term to talk about globalization is that it's a concept that actually has multiple dimensions. So of course, the economic dimension is important, but there's also military globalization. So something like putting bases overseas to protect some countries' geopolitical interests. That's globalization. That's the globalization of security. Something like the spread of disease across borders, right? Moving, COVID-19 from Wuhan, China, to the United States, to Italy, to Spain, to Brazil, to Jamaica, wherever. That's the globalization of disease. Something like climate change, where the emission of greenhouse gases from industrial processes in the developed world is creating rising sea levels and increasing typhoons in developing countries. That's also globalization, environmental globalization. So there are multiple different elements to globalization. Some of it is good, I think most of us would say, and some of it is certainly negative. But it is a much broader process than just a kind of economic globalization that most people think about. Something else to keep in mind with globalization: most people think of globalization as something fairly recent, and if you look at recent studies and articles on globalization, they usually refer to the era of modern globalization as starting in about the 1980s going forward, particularly after the end of the Cold War, when this massive section of the international society suddenly became open to global markets. But as we all know, when we looked at the pre-World War I era, globalization is not particularly new. And in fact, it has waxed and waned over time. So it's not inevitable. It doesn't go only in one direction. It can become stronger in some time periods and weaker in others. And you can have times where you strengthen one aspect of globalization while shrinking others. So for instance, the movement of people, the movement of labor, that has become increasingly more difficult over time, even as we have the spread of environmental globalization, right? So climate change is increasing, even though we're making it harder for people to cross borders. So this means that the elements of globalization do not all progress in the same direction at the same time, and they don't always benefit the same people. Now, what's also important about this, and which is tied to this observation, is that globalization is not inevitable, it's not natural, it's not unguided. Globalization, and the way that we understand it, is a process that has been set up and been managed by various actors, including international institutions, governments, and of course non-state actors like firms, NGOs, activists, and so on, right? Multiple actors have had a part in shaping how globalization has progressed. It's not the invisible hand of the market, so to speak, that's guiding it. It's a bunch of different actors with different interests. And so what the economic structuralists ask us to do is pay attention to who these interests are, what were the rules and institutions that have been set up to guide globalization in certain ways, and how do these rules benefit those interests, and do they contradict with the interests of other actors. And the economic structuralists in particular, but not only, focus a lot on the economic aspect of globalization, but it is integrated with others. So if you look at Gunder Frank, for instance, right, the way that he describes the current system of globalization is that he links it directly to the capitalist market. So on page 2 of the recommended reading from last time, he says, quote, "The expansion of the capitalist system over the past century has effectively and entirely penetrated even the apparently most isolated sectors of the underdeveloped world. This has been a single historical process of capitalist development." So what does Gunder Frank mean by this? So first, again, he's linking the current capitalist system to other elements of globalization that had taken place in the past. Slavery was an example of globalization, right? As was the colonialist system. Okay. Second, he makes observation that so many elements of what make up human society and our relationship to one another and the earth have now been incorporated into this global market economy in ways that they hadn't been before. So a few cases that talk about how markets have become globalized and how these have reshaped other ways of living in the world. One of the elements of the modern capitalist global market is that certain goods have a value insofar as they can be privatized and converted into commodities that can be exchanged on the open market for some kind of economic revenue or what have you, right? And so one example of this would be the development of intellectual property rights over plant genetic material, which really accelerated after the 1980s, after a Supreme Court case in the United States and the adoption by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, and then later the WTO, of certain norms which argued that it is possible to privatize plant genetic material and animal genetic material, own it, patent it, and then sell that information for a profit, for revenue. Right? And that might seem obvious and straightforward now, but that was not always the way in which we have managed plant genetic material. And throughout most of human history, in fact, plant genetic material has been something that has been belonged to what we call the common heritage of mankind. So, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1980s and 1990s, up through the early 2000s, there was a community called the San people that live in the region near South Africa and Namibia. And there are nomadic people that use a plant called hudia for when they go on long marches and so on. They chew the plant and it gives them energy. Also turns out that those same properties of the plant can be used as an appetite suppressant. And so Pfizer, a pharmaceutical company, traveled to the San area and made a deal with the San people that they would privatize ownership of hudia, convert it, take it, make it into a diet pill, a diet supplement, and then commodify it, and then give some resources or some of the royalties to the hudia people, to the San people that knew where the plant was and that they got some of this information from. And for certainly this did bring some economic resources to the San people. Others felt that they were alienated from the use of this plant, and it created some psychological tension or some psychological harm for some of the community people in the area that still depended on the use of this plant. In addition to creating more stress on that plant because now it was being produced not just for local people but also for this international market. So that is one of the ways in which goods that had been previously not included into the global capitalist market have become more included over time. You can look at something like the carbon credit market. Right now, the way that we're managing climate change is that we're encouraging countries to convert, especially the developing countries, convert large areas of their land into carbon sinks, or to classify them as carbon sinks, and to sell what we call carbon credits on the international market to countries and to other actors that are trying to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. So in essence, what that means is that every piece of land, every pristine piece of land on Earth now has the possibility of being incorporated into a market for carbon sinks. It's a very interesting process, and again, I speak about this in more detail in my class on international environmental politics. But that's just one of the ways in which all sectors of human society, pastoral use, farming, small-scale manufacturing and so on, is now being incorporated into this global capitalist market in ways that it hadn't been before. And again, this is important to think about when you realize that the global market is something that is being shaped by rules that have been created by institutions and other actors over time to make things function in a certain way. And so I'll speak a little bit about some of these, in particular the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. Now, one thing that's important to remember, and again, Galliano and others always ask this question, when you look at the rules that have been created, you always have to ask who set them up and for what purpose. So one of the things to keep in mind is that the IMF and the World Bank, which are called the Bretton Woods institutions, were created at a time when a large section of the developing world was not independent. In other words, they were not autonomous actors when these institutions were created. So Bretton Woods, for instance, the conference that led to the creation of the IMF and the World Bank, took place in 1944. India did not become independent until 1947. Most of sub-Saharan Africa did not become independent until the 1960s. Ditto for the Caribbean. Okay, and so if you have institutions that were established with so many sections of the international society not participating in them, that raises an immediate question about whose interests were being served at the time that these institutions were created. Now, that's not to say that that necessarily means that these institutions are problematic. And I'll speak a little bit about some of the critiques of them, but that's an immediate first step in thinking about whose interests are served and whose interests are not. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which then led into the WTO, that was signed in 1947. So again, before, roughly about the same time that India became independent, but before Bangladesh was independent, before, again, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria, which became independent in 1960. So what did these organizations do? So I'll just give a very brief overview. If you want to learn more about them, I recommend taking a class with Gary Winstead, because he does international political economy. So the IMF was created in order to stabilize exchange rates among countries, and make sure countries had a stable balance of payments, and other elements of maintaining stable macroeconomic fiscal policy. The World Bank's primary mission is development, and so what it would do is give loans to countries to promote developmental projects, usually large infrastructure. Creation of dams was one of the big things that the World Bank did, like throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and so on. Funding of infrastructure projects like highways, like Brazil's famous Polo Noroeste that took place throughout the 1980s and so on, right? All these kind of large-scale infrastructure developments from the World Bank. They also do things like sponsor schools sometimes, educational programs, health programs, environmental conservation projects, and so on. It's primarily from the World Bank. So they don't do exactly the same thing, but they do tend to overlap in that countries that borrow from the IMF oftentimes usually also borrow from the World Bank or get projects funded by the World Bank. And these organizations are set up in such a way that the goals of one organization do not end up conflicting with the goals of another of these organizations. This is something called cross-conditionality. So in other words, even though they don't do exactly the same thing, one does development, one does macroeconomic policy, they do have certain principles that they share and try to operate around. One of which is they tend to emphasize the privatization of property. So for instance, one of the big criticisms or concerns about the IMF in the past is that it has consistently pushed countries that borrow from it to privatize social spending, privatize healthcare, privatize education, and so on, right? Oftentimes pushing them to cut funding for pensions, cut the amount of people employed by the government in the public sector, and push them towards increasing employment in the private sector, privatizing utilities, and so on, right? Now, the effect of these things has usually been to cut the social safety net in countries that implement these policies. It's often hard to defend public spending on socially needed goods from the IMF, because the IMF has often been very stringent about getting governments to cut social spending in order to receive these loans. Now, the World Bank, in order to not conflict with the IMF, has often also pushed countries to privatize, again, public utilities, sometimes access to water, access to healthcare and so on, as a condition for getting World Bank projects in order that the World Bank and the IMF work hand in hand. So the way the IMF and the World Bank work is that they're international institutions. International institutions are made up of states. So you might ask yourself, well, there are more developing states in the world than there are industrialized states. So why has the IMF had such a long record of promoting structural adjustment policies that have emphasized cutting spending on healthcare, cutting spending, public spending on education and so on? Why don't developing countries simply push organizations to act in a way that is more sympathetic to their interests, let's say? And part of the reason is that according to the way that these institutions were set up, voting is established according to the size of your economy and the amount of your contribution to these organizations. So if you look at the following charts, for instance, if you look at this graph right here, which comes straight from the World Bank, the top 8 countries voting power. So here we have the United States. That's 16% of all the votes in the World Bank group. Japan is next with 8%. So together those two countries are about a quarter. China's there with 5%, even though it has 1/5 of the world's population. Then you have Germany with 4.3%. You have the UK with 4%. There's France with 4%. There's India, another developing country with 1/5 of the world population that has 3%. Then you have Canada with 3%, right? So if you add India and China together, that is 8% of the entire votes in the World Bank for 2/5 of the population of the Earth. And the others, that's 24%, that's like 30-something percent, are all held by industrialized countries. And then, of course, if you imagine many of the other countries that borrow from the World Bank and the IMF, like Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so on, they have oftentimes fractions of a percent of a vote. So their ability to shape the outline of the projects that they receive, that they get funded for, the outline of the loans that they get funded for, the conditions on these loans, very highly constrained. All of the decision-making powers, or the majority of it, is held by the industrialized world. And you can get a sense of this by looking at this next clip, which comes from a documentary on the effect of these cross-cutting loan conditions, what's called cross-conditionality, on the development of agriculture in Jamaica.
First of all, you go to the private banking system and you see, well, can I get a private banking loan? Because I'm strapped for cash, I need some support, and I'm having trouble paying my overseas bills.
When the private banks won't lend to you, then you've got to do something if you're the leader of a country. And typically what you've got to do is to cut back your spending in some way and try and get more money so that the impact of those cutbacks are not as severe as they otherwise would be. And it's at that point that you generally come to the IMF.
What you really need is to sit down with them and say, look, can I work out a 5-year program? And in the meantime, I'm strapped for some cash, so can you help me up front get out of the cash bind and then put it in the context of a long-term development plan? And they said, no, long-term development is your problem. We are here only to see who do you owe the money to, why are you in a bind, and we'll lend you some money in a very short time frame at full interest rate to get you out of the bind. And they then impose upon you tremendous restrictions in what you can spend.
And then we reach agreement on a set of measures on the budget, on the exchange rate, on monetary policy, on interest rates, on banks, on maybe privatization, and say, yep, we think this could solve your problem.
And you say to them, but if I do it that way, when I finish repaying you, I'm going to be in the bind all over, because this can't solve my problem. This is not our problem.
The whole idea was to set conditions which the government could not meet. And when the government failed to meet them, you would have to renegotiate a new loan in which the conditions became tighter. So the IMF didn't say, cut out this education program or cut out this health program. What the IMF said is, you must spend only so much money on health and education. And the implication of that was that you had to cut out some programs. Essentially, what the IMF wanted us to do was to devalue our currency. That's the first thing, to make our dollar cheaper.
They needed to expand their exports and diminish their imports. And the best way of doing that is to make foreign currency more expensive.
And since our society is so heavily dependent on imported food, imported fuel, imported books to go to school, imported medicine, when we devalue, the cost of those things we import go up to the citizens. And as a result, the economy today is much more under the control of foreigners, not necessarily through direct ownership, but through the mechanism of debt. In the 1970s, we owed $800 million. By the end of the 1980s, we owed $4 billion. Nowadays, we owe $7 billion. So the debt is rising, and all the time the debt is rising, our capacity to export, to produce, is getting less.
So something else, as that clip indicates, is that in addition to existing in the economic system, this global system that has rules that have been shaped by actors other than them, developing countries are also vulnerable to the history of debt and loan borrowing from rich countries that they've tended to borrow money from. So the short version is that the interest rate on loans that developing countries have to take out from industrialized countries in order to do things like import medicine and food and fuel and so on. The interest rate on these loans are often determined, not often, they are determined by the political economy of the industrialized world, the relationship of banks, domestic interest rates set by banks, and so on, right? And so what this means is that if there is a banking crisis in the industrialized world, the effects of that and the effects of that, those changing interest rates are going to ripple out to developing countries. And what has taken place over time is that developing countries may have borrowed a certain amount of money at a particular interest rate and then have those interest rates increase such that it becomes harder and harder for them to pay off loans that they had borrowed in good faith, even for things that are vital necessities. And this in particular is important because usually when people think about the flow or the global flow of money, the flow of resources internationally, they think about it in the sense of money tends to flow from rich countries to poor countries, right? Rich countries are the ones that fund the World Bank. They fund the IMF. They're the ones who give out aid in the form of foreign direct investment through organizations like USAID or CEDA, which is a Canadian version of USAID, or the German Development Bank, or what have you. In reality, however, if you compare the amount of money that goes from rich countries to poor countries in the form of foreign aid, and look at the amount of money that goes from poor countries to rich countries, you see something pretty interesting. So for instance, in 2012, the total of all aid, investment, and income to less developed countries totaled $1.3 trillion. That's $1.3 trillion in entirety of all aid to poor countries. However, the outflows, which are mainly comprised of debt servicing from poor countries to rich countries, were $3.3 trillion. In other words, poor countries gave rich countries $2 trillion more than they received in aid of all forms in 2012. So what this tells us is that in the current global system, in rules that have been established by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO, which I haven't talked about much so far, that wealth is flowing from poor countries to rich countries. A situation that is very similar, of course, to what took place under actual colonialism or direct colonialism, right? We still have the expropriation of wealth, it just looks very differently, and it's guided by different kinds of institutions. And so since I mentioned the WTO, again, I'll talk about that other aspect of economic globalization. So we have development and ideas about development, mostly through the World Bank. We have international economic flows, currency exchange rates, balance of payments, and so on, mostly through the IMF. And then you have trade. That's another element of economic globalization. So trade rules, of course, are established by the WTO, for the most part by the WTO, and then you have your various regional trade institutions as well, like NAFTA and the EU and so on, right? Organization of African States and so on, right? And these institutions function differently from the IMF and the World Bank in that they tend to be one state, one vote, rather than the IMF and World Bank, which are, one state, a whole bunch of votes, and then a bunch of other states, a fraction of a percentage of a vote. So they're somewhat less immediately non-democratic in that way. However, because these organizations are often governed by very technical and arcane trade rules, they tend to be dominated by institutions that have the ability to hire trade lawyers to get the kind of technical expertise in trade law to shape rules in a certain way. And these organizations as well, the WTO and the other various organizations, also share certain principles with the IMF and the World Bank to ensure that their goals also do not conflict with the goals of those organizations. Once again, that has tended to emphasize private property, commodification of goods, free movement of capital, less attention paid to the movement of labor and so on, and certainly avoiding governmental interference in the marketplace. One of the primary objectives of the WTO is to get governments to stop subsidizing the production of goods on the that would enter into the international market, which is most goods. Argument, of course, is that having governments subsidize whether it's agriculture or manufacturing or electronics and so on, makes the production of those goods inefficient and hurts consumers and therefore hurts the global economy, which is a reasonable argument. The problem, of course, is that, again, this is predicated on the idea that allowing everyone to compete in a free field, so to speak, is the best way to maximize the overall welfare. But again, from the economic structuralists, you have to remember that production and manufacturing in developing countries did not start at the same point as production and manufacturing in industrialized countries because of the history of colonialism, which we covered in the previous video. So in short, the WTO and the various other trade organizations, the IMF and the World Bank Group, do different things, but they have very similar overlapping norms about the political economy and the relationship of the economy to society. They've tended to emphasize privatization, commodification, marketization, and so on, right? Now, these principles altogether have been known historically as the Washington Consensus. And the reason it's called the Washington Consensus is that this norm that the neoliberal market economy is the best way to organize an economy emerged in large part through Washington, D.C. in the 1980s and in the United Kingdom as well after Margaret Thatcher came to power. So Thatcher and Reagan were the two essential architects of the current neoliberal order. Now, something to underline as well is that when we think of the current economy as a free market economy or an open market economy, it's also important to pay attention to who exactly is free to move about in this open economy. And as Naik and Selvin point out, not all actors have the same ability to move across borders as others. And this is particularly relevant to the United States, including somewhere like Vermont, where Middlebury is based. So the short version is that movement of, or movement, economic movement tends to benefit industrial actors and the holders of capital far more than labor, right? Multinational corporations have a much easier time moving to other countries, relocating. Certainly financial speculators do, right? Financial investors and so on, right? It's a lot easier to move and find competitive places to be, places where the cost of production are lower and so on, as a capitalist, as an industrialist, than it is to move as a laborer. And we can see this taking place in the United States with a vast quantity of undocumented labor in the United States, right? So why are people coming into the country undocumented? It's not because they're prone to criminality. It's because moving as a laborer across borders is extremely difficult, complex, arduous, hard to navigate, and so on. Moreover, it's often sometimes physically more difficult than it is to move, financial sums and speculation from one country to another, which often requires, just internet banking and so on, right? And so what this means is that because movement as labor is so difficult, oftentimes the only way people can physically enter another country is by doing so in an undocumented fashion. This, of course, opens them up to further exploitation because they're not here legally, so to speak, and it's oftentimes much harder to protect their, basic human rights, their labor rights, which in turn makes it easier for corporations and for other actors to exploit them. And of course, this is one of the biggest issues that we've been dealing with in Vermont recently, trying to get people to produce what we call milk with dignity, right? And this is a big part, of course, of the production of agriculture in the southern part of the United States. So as Naik and Selman say, bodies do not cross borders easily. They may be abused, criminalized, commodified, categorized, or immobile. And so what moves freely in the free economy is actually capital and not so much labor. So this is all a bunch of different processes working together, right? And again, this system is very different from historic colonialism, historic imperialism, right? There are some things that are shared with it, okay? So in, kind of traditional or classical colonialism, you had a colonial center that authorized some kind of, mercenary actors to go into a country that was not, or not a country, go into an area that was not part of the modern world. And through force and the use of, law, so to speak, bring that area into the international economy and expropriate wealth from the poor, from the underdeveloped area to the rich center of the empire, okay? And you did this with an army, with an occupying force, and so on. But then we had independence, okay? We had, starting in Latin America and then spreading across the rest of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and so on, okay? And now, what is taking place is different in some important ways, but also similar in some ways. So you don't have the kind of, Columbus working for the crown anymore. Instead, what you have is corporations going into other countries. You have the mechanism of debt. You have international loans and international institutions and so on. But you still have the same kind of expropriation of wealth from poor to rich. So Arundhati Roy, in talking about this, describes the current situation as one that's like imperialism, but it's not really imperialism. And the way she talks about empire in her article kind of makes it clear that the process right now is a bit more amorphous than had been the case before. So as she says, on page 1, in Resisting Empire, she says, quote, "We need to identify what empire means. Does it mean the US government, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and multinational corporations? Empire has sprouted other subsidiary heads. All of these march arm in arm with corporate globalization." And so what she's getting at there, again, is this just reinforces this idea that the current state of expropriation is taking place with different actors that are different in some important ways, even though the end result is very similar to the classical form of imperialism. Finally, I want to talk about inequality. One of the defining features of modern globalization and this process of the spread of capitalism, particularly after the 1980s, is that income inequality globally has increased noticeably, okay? And this might seem a little bit counterintuitive, especially given that in the initial part of this video I mentioned that China is actually pulling more people out of poverty, right? However, globally speaking, the top percent of the top 1% of the world's population, and the top 1% of that 1% is accumulating wealth much faster than the rest of the earth, of the international society. And if you take a look at this graph, for instance, what it shows is the comparison of wealth between the bottom 50% of the world's population and the richest 62 people on earth. And so what you've seen is that even though the bottom 50%, the wealth of the bottom 50% has increased between 2000 and 2015, the wealth of the richest 62 people on earth has also increased, such that it is actually roughly on par as of 2015 with the total wealth of the bottom 50%. That's like 3.7, 3.5 or something like that billion people. If you look at the United States as well, and so this shows income inequality global. So the first one shows income inequality globally across people. The next shows income inequality in the United States. If you look again at around the 1980s, like right when Reagan came into power, and the top 10% share of income between 1970 to 2008, again what you see is that the top 10% has accumulated wealth much faster than it had been for the past several decades. Now, many people might say, well, that's true, right? The data does suggest that there is increasing global income inequality, but is that necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, if rising tide lifts all boats, and if we have a growing world economy, which we do, and we have most countries have a average GDP that's going up, which they do, then what difference does it make that some people gain more than others? Rising tide lifts all boats, so to speak, and if some boats get lifted faster than others, like why is that necessarily a bad thing? So it's worth thinking about, what is it about income inequality or inequality in general that might be alarming to West and to Arundhati Roy and to Walter Rodney and others? Like, what is it about income inequality that is so threatening? Does it destabilize a political system? Is it bad for the United States that the top 1% and the top 1% of that 1% are the ones who have been accumulating more wealth, particularly after 2008? And if so, then what is the concern? Like, why is income inequality a potential threat? So I'll leave you with that. Again, just to kind of recap what we've talked about today. So we've looked at globalization and this idea that it's a multidimensional thing. It's not just the economy, but that is an important part of it. We looked at how globalization has been facilitated by international institutions, some of the principles of these institutions and how they've been adopted. And we paid attention to some of the concerns that economic structuralists have had about what globalization is doing, how it's creating income inequality. It's worth thinking about why people might be concerned about that, how it's led to the continued expropriation of wealth from poor to rich, and how some of the elements of modern globalization look very similar to classical colonialism or classical imperialism, even though, as Arundhati Roy points out, they're not exactly the same thing. All right, so that's going to be it. Enjoy W, Wu-Tang, and have a good day.